In previous operations in Gaza, the Israelis stated that they want to basically reduce the power of Hamas and make sure that it can't attack Israel. But now they've clearly stated military objectives is to dismantle Hamas completely and make sure that Gaza can never be used again as an attack point against Israel. So that necessarily means the assumed mission would be total elimination of Hamas terrorists.
Welcome back. I'm here again with my good friend, Franc Milburn. How you doing, my friend?
Hey, brother. How's it going, mate? Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you, too. It's always good to see you. Okay. So today we're going to talk about a very controversial topic, and we're going to try to do it without the controversy. So as you're watching this, we're going to discuss the current operations in Gaza, and we're going to try to do it from a very professionalized view of the Israelis have a problem that they have to solve. How can they do it in a way that minimizes the impact to civilians who, frankly, are caught in this mess and don't deserve bad things to happen either side? And how do they get at Hamas in a way that they can surgically, to the extent that that's even possible in this situation, and annihilate that organization? And at the same time, we might even look at it from the other perspective. What can Hamas do to kind of slow things down and achieve victory in whatever their sense of the word? That's going to be a little bit more difficult. But again, we're not trying to make any judgment calls here. Just right now, there's a problem that has to be solved. And you have two former professional military officers with experience in these sorts of things talking about it. All right. So, Frank, what's the situation here?
Well, are we talking about the tactical situation, Sean?
Let's start with the strategic, and then we'll get to the operational tactical very quickly.
Well, the strategic is that Israel suffered this horrendous, brutal, and barbaric attack on 7th of October. And that has basically shattered what was the previous accommodation which Israel had with Hamas, because Israel has fought Hamas on numerous previous occasions. And there was a kind of like a modus operandi whereby the Israelis would allow in, aid, fuel, water, and supplies, and also allow Gazans to work with permits inside Israel in return for Hamas not launching attacks against Israel. But since this attack, we've seen that now Israel has totally blockaded the Gaza Strip, and they are basically denying all suministro in Spanish, all kinds of supplies into the Gaza Strip, precisely because Hamas is dug in tunnels beneath civilian infrastructure. And also for years, Hamas has appropriated fuel, medicine, food, water, all kinds of supplies that were destined for Gaza's civilian population, including using water pipes that were imported, steel water pipes, to make rockets. And also the billions in aid that have been spent in Gaza by the UN and by donors like the United Arab Emirates. They have all been used to fabricate buildings with dual-use purposes by Hamas on the surface, firing points, and below the surface, with tunnels linking not only Hamas command, rocket, smuggling, and infiltrational tunnels, but also linking those to civilian houses and hospitals, so that Hamas terrorists can emerge from whichever point to carry out hit-and-run attacks.
Just to add to that as well, the timing of this is very interesting, particularly since the Abraham Accords, I think, were on the verge of being signed between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So the timing, you could argue, is coincidental, but I doubt it. I think the Iranians kind of likely have a hand in this, in the sense that having Israel and Saudi Arabia getting closer is not great for the balance of power for the Iranians in the region. Now, there's also the complication that Hamas is Sunni, the Iranians are Shia, but I really don't think that the Iranians necessarily care, because they can use Hamas as a harassment tool. Additionally, the U.S. has 2 aircraft carrier groups that are in the region. I believe, and again, I hope the audience checks me on this, but I believe it's the largest armada in NATO history in one region. So the other thing that's important to note is that there's a number of hostages that have been taken into these tunnels, and they're not just Israeli hostages. A lot of them, or many of them, have dual U.S. Israeli citizenship. So there are Americans that have been taken hostage. Have a number of Brits been taken hostage as well?
Yeah, there's some Brits, Germans, other nationalities. But I want to say, Sean, I mean, you were a soldier, I was a soldier, I served in Iraq. You expect as a soldier to be attacked by the enemy, that the enemy wants to kill you. And to be honest, the outrages in Israel on October the 7th would have affected me less had they only been directed against the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, because you would expect terrorists of Hamas to attack the IDF. But the fact that they looted, raped, kidnapped, and burnt babies in their cribs was designed to terrorize not just Israeli society, but also broader Western society as well.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
Well, and the other thing that's important to note, too, is civilians die as part of war, but Western militaries don't typically attack civilians to attack civilians. It's typically collateral damage. There's things that happen. This was a deliberate attack on defenseless women and children. So it would be very difficult for any nation to accept an attack like this without a response, right? Just live and let live. As an example, let's take the United States. People really don't realize that after 9/11, in the number of operations that have been spawned since then, according to the Watson Institute, which is at Brown University, the direct and indirect loss of life as a result of that was in the range of 4.7 to 4.9 million. Okay? Like million people, right? Close to 5 million people died as a result of that. So this is 1,400 people is very likely worse than 9/11. And people also need to understand that the size of that region is back in the late 60s, early 70s, the Arab nations around Israel could have cut that country in half in less than half a day, given the distances involved. So you have to understand, when you're surrounded by 700 million people that want to kill you, want to exterminate your people, you have to be aggressive. Now, that's not to completely absolve the Israelis in terms of loss of life, but again, they have good technology and things like that, but they're not like the US or the UK in terms of the level of technological sophistication they have. They also have a lot of reservists that are coming in that are professional, but they're not going to be able to exert the same level of professionalism and care just simply because they're not trained as extensively. And particularly in this situation where they're trying to push a lot of people through basic training. So we have to put all of this in context. But in the same respect, you're talking about urban combat operations, which are about the worst type of operations you'd ever want to conduct, particularly after a ton of rubble is created, right? When you see a picture of that destroyed downtown Gaza, a civilian would look at it and say, oh my God, what a horrible loss of life. But, the military has cleared this out and, it should be a little bit easier. When Frank and I look at that, there's a hide, there's an ambush site. There's plenty of places for folks to hide. Anyway, let me step back. So one of the things I wanted to, let's dive kind of into the operational level, because that kind of sets up the strategic piece. When you're talking about tunnels, Frank, can you say a little bit more, like how extensive are these tunnels? How deep do they go? If you have any of the statistics, how many miles, where do they connect? And how would the Israelis even think about clearing them out?
Okay, sure. From what I've gathered from talking to Israeli IDF friends and also from listening to Hamas say we have 500 kilometers of tunnels beneath Gaza, which is possibly feasible. The Israelis talk about between 200 and 300 kilometers beneath Gaza, right? And Gaza is basically, it's like 40 kilometers long and about, 4 to 5 kilometers wide. So that's perfectly feasible. It's the most extensive tunnel system probably like ever built, apart from maybe North Korea.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Bain Books at bain.com.
But how the Israelis would go about it? The Israelis, they're two countries in the world that have the most extensive urban warfare and underground warfare training facilities. Those are the United States and the Israeli Defense Forces. The way the Israeli Defense Forces will approach this, and the way they have been approaching this, is the Israeli Defense Forces, one of the strategic doctrines is to lose the minimum amount of soldiers because they recognize that the IDF has a limited manpower pool. And they've just raised 360,000 soldiers, which pulls a lot of blokes and women from the economy, right? So it's a major drag on the economy at the same time, as well as providing sources of casualties. The way they'll go about tunnels, the tactical doctrine of the IDF is they will identify, isolate, cordon and control tunnels. And then the tactical doctrine is not to put troops inside the tunnels because those are basically death traps. They will seal off the tunnels. Now, there's different ways they can do that. They can use that either by air power, but on the ground blokes, they'll be using either filling it with cement, or the Israelis, they have a kind of like a rapid expanding foam that it's similar to what you use in modern day construction to like fill gaps, like a rapidly expanding foam. It's like a binary material. Once the two chemicals combine, it produces a rapidly expanding foam that makes a very, very dense cement-like material. They can also use gas, like poison gas, but I don't think the Israelis will use that in civilian areas because then they'll be accused of human rights issues. And also as well...
Yeah, the Chemical Weapons Convention violations and stuff like that.
And also as well, then as you know, operating in seaburn environment, once you're wearing a mask and you're wearing the suit, it severely degrades the ability of the operators to operate tactically. But I think the Israelis, they'll be using the foam, they'll be using explosives in the tunnels, they'll certainly use a type of inert gas, smoke, to identify where the entrances and the exits to the tunnels are. And I think also close to the coast, I've been listening to Urban Warfare Project at West Point, and I think also that there's a possibility that the Israelis could use horizontal drilling techniques, like you use oil and gas.
For shale,
tunnels, right. And then you pump it full of seawater and basically like drown the terrorists like rats inside.
All right, so there's several complications here. So, well, first of all, you mentioned CBRN, so it's chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and what's the E? I can't remember. We use this stuff, we know exactly what it means, but we can never remember this stuff. People can look it up. It's not, I got most of it. I know I'm 100% sure I got most of it, but
I'm looking up.
That just means nuclear, biological, and chemical stuff, right? But one of the complications that you run into with kind of flooding it with seawater, because that's certainly what I would do if there weren't American citizens, British citizens, and Israeli citizens in those tunnels. So the complication is there are friendlies in those tunnels. And there's very likely the way that Hamas fights human shields, right? So
I would expect the 200 plus hostages that Hamas have, the ones that haven't been killed already by Hamas or raped to death, or that haven't been killed in Israeli airstrikes and bombardments, they will be used as final shields to protect the Hamas leadership against the final Israeli assault and or to negotiate their release. But what I don't see, I can't see the Israelis agreeing to release 900 or 9,000 Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists from jail in return for those hostages, because those very same terrorists are the ones who entered into Israel on the 7th and murdered and raped and looted and killed and burned babies their way through Israel. So that's not an option for the Israeli government. I think there would be outrage from certain sections, not from the parents of the hostages, but there would be outrage on the part of the greater Israeli population if the government were to release thousands of terrorists from jail in return for the hostages, because those terrorists are the very same who have murdered, looted, and raped in Israel.
Well, this is the reason that the U.S. has an official policy of not negotiating with terrorists. That said, the fact that we had $6 billion waiting for Iran in Qatar before all this starts, so people are like, oh, well, that's not for this sort of thing. It's for something else. It's like, well, money is fungible, right? The Iranians see that $6 billion coming, so they could just pull $6 billion from somewhere else and use it to fund these operations.
Like cockroaches to a piece of shit.
Yeah, basically. So,
sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, again, we got to be professional, Frank, professional. I'm working hard to be professional here, even though it's hard. It's very hard. Now, there's also been reports that Delta is there, and Delta is there for very obvious reasons, right? Which is I suspect right now, some people might speculate that they're behind the scenes talking to the Israelis. But they're probably in the environment, disguised as somebody else, gathering intelligence right now to figure out where these hostages are. At the same time, I'm sure the U.S. is, just telling Hamas, like, look, you need to release our hostages. You just need to do it. And nowhere else, because I think that's just left unstated. And then I think once Delta gets a little bit more information, they do what they do best, which is very similar to what the SAS does, which is, fine precision shooting and ending engagements relatively rapidly. And so before I think the Israelis kind of do the flooding, I think they're very likely marking out where these places are, limiting the number of entrance and exit points that they can, and then going to do their very best due diligence to try to find most of these hostages. But after a certain point, when they get to the point where they're committing the majority of the forces, then I think they do exactly what you said they're going to do. They flow them out.
Can I say something, mate? I think,
absolutely.
I disagree on 2 points. Yeah, I think, there'll certainly be Delta and, Brit SF blokes in Israel, as there always have been, working with the Israelis. But I don't think that Delta will be in an operational capacity. One, because it's not their jurisdiction. And two, because, if the Israeli SF, Sayeret Makhtar, Shaldag, Halom, and, the other Israeli SF units, if they're having a problem identifying where the hostages are being held by the terrorists, the Americans and the Brits and others won't have a hope in hell. I'm sure that all those operations will be run by Israelis. And also for the other factor that, if, for example, Special Air Service or Delta were to insert into Gaza, and if they were captured, then that would just be like a major jamboree in terms of, oh, look, the Brits, the Americans, their special forces are, supporting the Israelis. I really don't think that's a feasible operational scenario. I really don't think the Brits and the Americans will get their hands wet like the Israelis. I think they will be consulting with the Israelis, maybe advising the Israelis, but nobody knows Gaza better than the Israelis.
Let's talk a little bit about Gaza. I think the area is something like 41 square miles, which, to give folks a sense of the context, so where the U.S. Army trains in the U.S. at the National Training Center, that's 1,000 square miles. Okay. Washington, D.C. is about half the size of Gaza. So you're operating in a very tight environment, very small, relatively speaking, area, but it's very tight in the sense that, there's debris everywhere. It's a kind of classic MALT.
Military operations in open terrain.
That's right. Thank you. As soon as I said that, I'm like, I remember the acronym, but I don't know what it stands for. Thank you.
Military operations in open terrain. And for our British viewers, it's HIBUA, fighting in built-up areas.
All right. So what takes one British paratrooper and one American cavalry officer 10 minutes to figure out that they should know? And that's what the E in CBRN is. What's the E in CBRN? Frank, what does it mean? We should know better, but what does it mean?
Explosives, mate. Explosives.
Explosive material. I thought explosives, but I'm like, doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make it like special, like different than anything normal. But explosive materials, whatever that means, right? There's the material part that's probably important. Okay. So we were talking about it's unlikely that Delta would, at least at this stage, have direct involvement. Same thing with SAS, just given the depth of intelligence that the Israeli military has, as well as like Shin Bet, Mossad, stuff like that, right? They would just have a better handle on where these things were placed. The other thing that occurred to me when we were talking, you were talking about the Hamas leadership. Aren't most of the Hamas leadership, aren't they in like Dubai right now?
Well, yeah, there's some in Russia, there's some in Damascus, there's some in Qatar. Yeah, they basically live the life. They drive Mercedes and their kids go to good schools while their people starve and get murdered in Gaza. And let's not forget, I mean, if you're living in Gaza, Gaza isn't a democratic society, right? So I would say to all these kind of like beating heart liberals in the US and the UK.
Easy, Frank. Easy, Frank. Easy, Frank. Let's keep it professional.
I just say, like, go to Gaza, walk down the main street, walk down Salahaddin Highway, shouting out, "Hey, I'm Christian, I'm Jewish, and I'm also gay," and see how long you survive.
I'm going to kind of diverge from the topic very, very, very briefly. I mean, it's the same topic, but it's what we're also seeing in the U.S. and Britain, actually. There's three anecdotes I'm going to tell. So in the U.S. and Britain, you are seeing folks posting just like missing posters of their loved ones for some of the people who were kidnapped and potentially killed by Hamas, which if you did that with Palestinians, it would be perfectly understandable to post those photos and things like that, because I'm sure there's a lot of missing Palestinians and their families are looking. But I would never, ever, ever consider ripping down help me find my family member, Palestinian or Jew. So what you're seeing is folks who essentially support Hamas. They claim to support Palestine, maybe they support both, but they're ripping these things down, which is completely insensitive. However, there's a recent video that's kind of gone viral now where people are starting to put razor blades, at least in the United States, on the back of these things, which I understand why they would do that, right? Because it's pretty cowardly and like just evil to
rip them down,
rip them down. But that's also that's a criminal act, right? Like I don't know what you would call it, but I understand why they would do that. But it's kind of escalating this way. And there's another example in the UK. So just be careful out there. I wouldn't recommend sabotaging any of this stuff. I wouldn't recommend pulling it down.
Touching any of this stuff.
Yeah. Just don't. I mean, these people that lost their loved ones. It's just bad form. Yeah, it's pretty sick. The other thing that I saw in the UK is there was a guy arrested for making a video commenting on there's too many Palestinian flags. What the hell is up with that? Why did that happen? Like, what's the dynamic going on in the UK that would have caused that sort of reaction? And then we'll get back to the tactical stuff. I'm just curious.
What, too many Palestinian flags? No, I didn't see that. But I'm assuming, I mean, I don't equate, Hamas with Palestinians, although obviously Hamas is a product of the society from which it is derived. But I don't equate people can say, free Palestine, whatever. I don't understand why that would happen.
Yeah, I don't either.
It's
just
kind of hatred.
I don't know. No, he's just saying there's too many flags. He didn't say anything that I thought was particularly. It's just opinion, right? Like people in the United States, particularly on the left, say there's too many American flags, right? Like, okay, you can say that.
My own opinion is if you support Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, any Iranian proxy, Iran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, Al Qaeda, ISIS. If you support any of those groups and you live in the West, then go and live in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or some other third world whole that accommodates those kinds of beliefs that you aspire to.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on, particularly on again, I don't want to pick on one political side, but there are a lot of people who are giving political candidates a hard time about, look, you can support the Ukraine thing or you not support the Ukraine thing. And there are valid reasons that you can make on both sides. Okay, let's just leave that there. But what happens is you have these activists who come up and are demanding that, like, why don't you support Ukraine and stuff like that? And I have a friend, he's an Army colonel, and he said, if I were a U.S. political candidate, I would bring with me an Army recruiter so that when these people come up and say, like, we need to be more involved in this and that, it's just like, oh, you can sign up right here. Like,
yeah, sign up right here, you fucking douchebag. Yeah.
Right.
Grab your testicles in your hand, squeeze them, and be a man.
And that's what this is so abstract for many Americans about how close we are, and I'm sure Brits too, that at some point, like, you can't rely on one segment of the population to do all your fighting, right? So just be very careful about which engagements you choose to get into. All right, so I just went from the domestic kind of scene. We're going to come back to what's actually going on in Gaza.
Roger, so far, mate.
Yeah, so we started talking about when you're going to start putting the seawater in the tunnels. At what point do you think that happens?
Well, that will happen. At the moment, the Israelis, they've cut off the Salahuddin Highway north-south. It looks like they're about 100, 200 meters from the coast to the south of Gaza City. It looks like basically they're reducing the urban area in the northern part of Gaza, like looking at the map. You've also had Israeli armored forces advance effectively down the beach. And also, don't forget, you'll have Israeli naval forces offshore who are providing fire support with ATGM 76 millimeter and also with 25 Mike cannon. So
ATGM, anti-tank guided missiles, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the Israelis will basically reduce. They've cut Gaza in half. They'll reduce the northern part. I would imagine that they will take weeks, if not months, to eliminate all the tunnels and Hamas terrorists there. And then they will concentrate on the southern half. It's basically like a python or a boa constrictor. They've bitten off the northern mouthful and they're going to deal with that. And they've cordoned off the southern mouthful. Once they've dealt with the north, then they will deal with the south. That's the way that I'm reading the Israeli military commanders.
Now, how are they dealing with civilian refugees? Like, what are they doing to try to get these folks in a systematic way out of harm's way? These folks, I'm particularly talking about the Palestinians who have hopefully nothing to do with this conflict.
Well, the Israelis abide by military law. They drop leaflets. They use what's called door knockers. They drop small munitions on top of buildings, which shake the buildings but don't collapse the buildings, so that civilians have a chance to flee. They issue SMS messages telling Gaza civilians which areas they're going to hit, and which obviously negates any aspect of Israeli surprise because they're informing civilians of the areas they're going to hit. But I would imagine they've already told Gaza civilians to go to the south, beyond the southern evacuation zone. In terms of humanitarian aid, that's going to be very difficult. That's going to depend upon Egypt. Egypt, don't forget, in 2008, Hamas blew a hole in the wall and the fence that they had then, and thousands of Gazans flooded into Egypt. Egypt under Sisi, it's like a military dictatorship. They have 30,000 Muslim Brotherhood prisoners in jail. Hamas is an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And for that reason, the Egyptians say, oh, we don't want Gazan refugees because we don't want to perpetuate the Israeli displacement of Palestinians. But the real issue is that they don't want to have more Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood terrorists in amongst those civilians in Egypt. And also don't forget, in the Sinai Peninsula, up until 2013, the Egyptians were fighting a particularly brutal and nasty Islamist insurgency, which was also Muslim Brotherhood instigated. So the Egyptians don't want to have another internal security problem caused by Hamas inside Gazan refugees fleeing to Egypt.
Now, as all this is going on, the Israeli military is squeezing this cordon. Do you have a sense for how many Hamas fighters there are?
I don't. I mean, there's estimates from 5,000 to 10,000. Then again, any swinging dick, you can give them an AK. And if you've just lost your family, like your housing block has just collapsed, and you've just lost like your wife and your 3 kids, somebody passes you an AK, then, you're Hamas, right?
Yeah, you got nothing left to lose, right? It's understandable.
It's understandable, and I would do the same in that situation.
Yeah, I would absolutely do the same. But yeah, it's kind of put yourself into that mindset, right? If they some outside force kills your family, take everything away from you, you don't care anymore. You got nothing left to live for. Might as well. So what about the West Bank? How does that complicate matters? What are the Israelis doing to kind of keep that quiescent?
Well, that's been a major problem, Sean. And the Israeli concentration, when I say Israeli concentration, the attention of the Israeli Defense Force and Shin Bet, because Shin Bet has operational responsibility for intelligence, counterintelligence in both the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And the West Bank is... And
Shin Bet, for people who don't know, Shin Bet is kind of the domestic intelligence organizations like FBI,
it's the
MI5.
Domestic security and counterintelligence service, but they also have responsibility for West Bank and Gaza Strip. But in the West Bank, that was one of the reasons why the IDF and Shin Bet and other security forces, they took their eyes off the ball. One was because Hamas, they had this accord from 2021 and earlier that the Israelis would allow in aid, and that the Israelis believed that Hamas was content with allowing some kind of economic development within Gaza, and that Hamas would restrict attacks against Israel. So the Israelis took their eye off the ball and they were focused on the West Bank. West Bank, a tinderbox. You've got a mix of basically the Palestine Authority, which has various levels of control over different areas of the West Bank, which the Israelis call Samaria and Judea. For example, the Jenin camp is basically a no-go zone for Palestine Authority security forces. And that's why the Israelis have mounted major raids there. A major irritant in Israeli-Palestinian relations has been the right-wing government in Israel and also settler attacks on Palestinians inside the West Bank, which doesn't help. But that's really what made the Israelis take their eyes off the ball in Gaza, was what was going on in the West Bank. I think that the Israelis can definitely keep a lid on what's happening in the West Bank because they can, to a certain extent, they can rely on the Palestinian authorities there to control their areas. But it's a completely different kind of socio-economic dynamic in the West Bank. But I don't see that emerging as a major source of threat as Gaza has been to the Israelis.
What about in the north, where you have Hezbollah and Lebanon? You have Syria. Maybe they decide they want to take the Golan Heights, which I think is unlikely given that they're still dealing with a civil war. So what are the Israelis doing to secure the northern border?
They've evacuated thousands of civilians, but nobody's going to take the Golan Heights from Israel because they've got some major units there. And it's just not physically feasible given the amount of firepower that the Israelis have in the north. I think that Iran will try to restrain Hezbollah. There have been rocket attacks and anti-GM attacks. But what one has to bear in mind is that Hezbollah has some 35,000 rockets pointed at Israel, everything from shorter range kind of Katyusha type rockets to a smaller number of GPS precision guided missiles that can hit anywhere in Israel, including the Dimona nuclear plant. But Iran uses Hezbollah as basically a deterrent against any Israeli attack against its own nuclear facilities. So Hezbollah is really a deterrent force for Iran. And I don't see, with the Israelis dug in on the Golan Heights and against Lebanon, I don't see that being a major problem for the Israelis being able to hold. And I think the Israelis, with the manpower they've generated, they're going to be able to concentrate their major combat forces against Gaza, however long that takes. And also as well, I'd add to that, I don't see Jordan, Egypt, or any other Arab state, nor Syria, trying to go to war against Israel, and especially not with 2 US carrier battle groups off the coast in the Med. That's not going to happen. I think the Americans have specifically placed those 2 strike groups specifically so that the Israelis can carry out their operations within Israel and the Gaza Strip.
Again, largest armada in NATO history, which leads to a ton of other questions. Do they really need that much to kind of keep things quiet elsewhere, or is there another purpose, in your opinion?
Well, they've got the 2 carrier strike groups off the coast because if Iran gets directly involved, overtly involved, and we've already seen the Americans reacting against attacks against their troops in Al-Tanf and along the border, the Syrian-Iraqi border, the Americans will launch ship-based and submarine launch cruise missiles against Iranian targets. And they also have the air power to generate, a massive airstrike capability against Hezbollah should that become required. And that's a key point, I think, because from the 2006 war with Hezbollah realized, Lebanon is being destroyed. And since then, the Israelis can generate hundreds more sorties per day than they could during the 2006 crisis. But the Americans have placed those carrier strike groups so close to Israel precisely so that the Israeli Air Force can concentrate on Gaza and also intercepting anything coming their way like drones from Syria or from anywhere else.
That's my next question. So the Iranians, since the Russians invaded Ukraine, all this stuff is connected, right? So the Iranians have become very proficient at producing fairly high quality drones at scale. Yeah, at scale. So what's the risk that you see a lot more of these drone swarms kind of coming and overwhelming Israeli air defenses and potentially slipping through and doing some damage? Because you sink one carrier, and that is a massive blow against the United States. So there is some risk there, isn't there?
Well, there is. And in the 2006 war, we saw Hezbollah, they actually hit an Israeli SAR-class corvette in the Mediterranean with an anti-ship missile, because the Hezbollah have anti-ship missiles. But I think if that were to happen, I think the American strike groups are very well protected against that. 2, if Hezbollah did launch an attack against American ships, then it would receive a devastating response.
Well, the other thing, too, is that this kind of drone warfare works both ways, right? So if they're cheaper to produce, you can mass produce them. The United States can mass produce hundreds of thousands of them at scale if they need to. So it's not like a completely asymmetric, right? Now, I'm going to go a little bit further afield, but we got to come right back. So we have the conflict in Ukraine right now. We have this conflict. What are the chances that the Chinese kind of look at all this, look at the weather conditions in April and May, and decide to roll the dice in Taiwan?
Yeah, I think that's a very big risk. The Americans are tied up. They've sent billions in aid, billions in munitions to Ukraine. Now they're tied into supplying billions in aid and munitions to Israel. And America is looking at a 3-front war strategically in Europe, in the Middle East, against Iran, and also against China. And I think that's a very real problem. Could I just add to that? I think, yes, Israeli defenses could be completely overwhelmed by the 35,000 rockets that Hamas has. But I think if Israel were overwhelmed and like Iron Dome, all the rest of it, if Israel started receiving hits around the Dimona nuclear plant, then I think...
Oh, yeah, we would intervene, absolutely. Right.
Well, no, then I would assess that you already have at least one Dolphin-class Israeli boat in the Indian Ocean, if not in the Persian Gulf, with Popeye cruise missiles, nuclear-tipped. And I think that if it came to that, and if Israel felt overwhelmed, then they would look to a nuclear option. And now, Israel has both land-based deliverable, aircraft deliverable, and also submarine deliverable nuclear weapons.
And Dolphin class is SLBM?
Yeah. They're diesel electric subs. They have a Popeye cruise missile, which actually from the Mediterranean, it can hit Iran. But I would assess that the Israelis would have at least one in the Indian Ocean so they can actually reach Tehran, Isfahan, and also Iranian nuclear facilities.
All right, so this could spiral out of control if it's not managed very carefully and confidently. Now, what about other potential flashpoints, particularly in the Bosphorus, kind of Black Sea adjacent? I believe Putin made a statement saying, this is not a threat. Just know that one of these carrier groups is within range of our hypersonic missiles. Not a threat. Just want to communicate that. Is there a chance that that potentially spirals out of control?
I don't think so, because Putin is not completely irrational, I don't believe. And he also knows that if he did that, if he directly targeted like the US or any member of NATO, if he targeted like Lithuania, then automatically the US, the UK, France, the three major military powers and nuclear powers in both the EU and NATO would have to respond. And I don't think he's stupid. Russian military power has been land power has been majorly degraded in Ukraine. The problem is, as you suggest, is that Russian naval power is still very, very effective. And literally the Russians, what I've seen like the last 20 years, I mean, I remember the Syrian war in 2016, they had like small missile boats, right? The Russians in the Caspian Sea that were launching cruise missiles to hit targets in Syria. The Russians have put shipborne cruise missiles on virtually anything that floats.
Yeah, the Caspian Sea is interesting because it's completely landlocked, right?
Yeah. Well, it's not completely landlocked because there are canals between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, but you can't move major ships through them. But what the Russians have done is what the Russians call a corvette, which would be like an offshore patrol vessel for the US Navy or the US Coast Guard. Every boat that the Russians have that's capable of carrying like a long-range cruise missile is carrying a long-range cruise missile.
The other thing that's fascinating about this particular conflict is it's all connected, right? Like this is a very useful distraction for Russia, for us, right? The head of Hamas, I believe, had been visiting Russia prior to all this. At the same time, prior to this conflict, there was also the conflict that's going on between Armenia and Azerbaijan, right? Yeah. And Armenia is kind of the Russian proxy, and Azerbaijan is the Israeli proxy. So there's, again, it's not receiving, it's not receiving a lot of press, and Americans aren't really that aware of it, but still, all this stuff is connected. So, all right, let's go back to the conflict. I didn't want to get too far up. All right, so now that we kind of have a good picture, again, of all the random things that are going on around Israel that connect all this stuff, we first talked about cutting off the north, right, and then slowly constricting. But we didn't talk about the units. What units are involved in this particular operation on the Israeli side?
Okay, well, you got Southern Command. And from what I've seen, I've been looking at the burials of Israeli soldiers and also the videos and looking at the berets of the Israeli soldiers involved. You basically got Southern Command units. You've got the 80th Territorial Division, but the primary divisions are the 167 Armored Division, which includes the Givati Brigade and the Nahal Infantry Brigade. And you can see those in action. But I'd also expect to see the Oz Commander Brigade in action there, which includes Maglan, Duvdevan. Duvdevan suffered heavy casualties initially, repelling the Hamas terrorists on the 7th of October, and also the Egoz, which is a guerrilla warfare unit. But there's also a very other interesting unit, which is the Bedouin Desert Reconnaissance Battalion. And there were 6 of them. And when the terrorists broke through and they actually reached the headquarters of the Gaza division, there were 6 Bedouin soldiers there. One was a major, one was a colonel, an Arab colonel who commands the unit. And they held off more than 200 Hamas terrorists. And the terrorists actually infiltrated the buildings. And they had some of the people who were fleeing the attack on the music festival. Yeah, they'd taken refuge there. And I saw this interview, and this Bedouin colonel, and he's speaking Hebrew with an Arabic accent, and he's explaining how he called in an airstrike from Israeli helicopters, from Apaches, and they actually put missiles through into the recreation building of the headquarters of the Gaza brigade because there were terrorists inside. And 6 blokes managed to hold off probably like 200 Hamas terrorists. And then there was a unit called Shaldag, which is one of 2 Israeli Air Force Special Forces units that actually came to relieve them.
They survived.
Oh, they survived, yeah. So you got the Oz Brigade, then also as well, you got some other interesting units. You've got the 33rd Caracal Battalion within that Gaza Division unit, which is a mixed female-male infantry battalion. Totally mixed infantry, male-female. And I'd also expect to see, I haven't seen them yet, because, being a paratrooper, I'm always looking out for red berets, but I'm always looking out for the Israeli Paratroopers Brigade, the 35th Israeli Paratroopers Brigade, because they are shock units for use in any kind of like urban warfare engagement. But I haven't seen any Israeli paras yet.
How would they be deployed? They're obviously not going to parachute them into a city, right? I'm assuming they would be on like Black Hawks or whatever the Israeli equivalent was and repel in.
No, they're going to go in on foot with infantry fighting vehicles. Right. What I see as the structure of the Israelis fighting in urban environments, they're going to have like a battalion combat team with bulldozers and engineering support attached, and then broken right down to the company unit. You're probably going to see 3 platoons, each platoon of 30 men, but with sapper support, with drone operators, with engineering support, and with tanks standing off at a distance to basically provide distance so they don't get hit by ATGMs, but making entry points into buildings and taking out any points of resistance with the 120 millimeter main gun. While you have closer in, you'll have infantry fighting vehicles, which will be closer in, following in the troops. The troops will clear the buildings, clear the areas, and then the armored infantry fighting vehicles will use chain guns and 7.62 guns to basically provide direct fire support.
So how high are the buildings in Gaza? Do they have like anything remotely resembling a skyscraper, or are they relatively low? So the reason I ask is if you're raiding a place with very high buildings, right, it's better to start by repelling people off helicopters and then having them clear down instead of clearing up, right? Just given the energy you'd require.
I very much doubt, this is just based on my own professional experience, I very much doubt that you will see commandos or special forces repelling from helicopters, simply because a stationary helicopter doing a rappel or a fast rope can be hit very easily by an RPG. I would expect Israeli special forces units to be infiltrating by sea or by land.
Now, what about the tanks that they're using? What's the composition? Are they mostly Merkavas? Do they have some M1s, like Abrams? What's that composition look like?
No, the Israelis have basically replaced all the frontline units in Southern Command, especially in the 167 Steel Armor Division. They're all Merkava, and some of them now have what's called comfort plates above them. But they'll be doing standoff. They'll be taking out buildings from a distance, and then infantry will be going in, taking over those buildings, establishing points of fire, and the tanks will move in closer. Tanks will take out other buildings, and then the infantry will move in closer.
As a tanker, I appreciate those tactics because you never want to be a tank in an alley in the middle of a city. It's just a death trap.
Exactly. But also, don't forget, each Israeli brigade involved, they also have a specialist Sayeret reconnaissance company and a specialist sapper company, which is expert in dealing with
explosives.
Tunnels. Right. Yeah, and as we said before, what they will do, the Israelis, they will identify where the tunnels are, they will cordon and control them, they will block the entrance to tunnels, and then will identify where their exit points are. And as they advance, then they will continue to block those tunnels. And basically, they will trap the Hamas terrorists like rats inside the tunnels. And in buildings where you have direct fire from Hamas, they will also use D9 remote bulldozers to basically collapse the buildings on top of the terrorists.
Now, what about people who've chosen not to flee? What are the reasons why there might still be civilians there? Granted, Hamas might not allow them to flee, but are there any civilians that just
force them not to flee? because every hospital, every civilian facility has deep dug in Hamas facilities, military facilities dug in below it. And Hamas has no interest in allowing civilians to flee, because the more civilians that are killed in airstrikes and bombardment by the Israelis, that more that fills into the Hamas narrative of brutalization by the Israelis. And also it's a win-win for them, because the more civilians killed, the more martyrs, the more kids that will grow up and want to be like, Hamas scumbags.
What do you think the Israeli strategic objective is? Like, what's the end state? What's the future of Gaza?
In previous operations in Gaza, the Israelis stated that they want to basically reduce the power of Hamas and make sure that it can't attack Israel. But now they've clearly stated military objectives is to dismantle Hamas completely and make sure that Gaza can never be used again as an attack point against Israel. So that necessarily means the assumed mission would be total elimination of Hamas terrorists. But that could take months.
Or years.
Yeah, if you look at recent urban warfare environments from Stalingrad, there was Pavlov's house where Soviets held off against Germans for 3 months. If you look at Mariupol, there were 1,200 Ukrainians. They held off 13,000 Russians for 3 months. Yeah, it could take a long time. But I think the Israelis are much better equipped than that. And also they're much better prepared and trained. And also as well now, the Israelis have got their arse up. They're pissed off. And they've accepted, they're prepared to take losses. And also, right. I think, reading between the lines, the Israelis are prepared to lose the lives of the hostages as well. Because the Israelis are thinking, well, now it's better than never. We have to destroy Hamas, dismantle them in the Gaza Strip, and make sure that the Gaza can never be a launching point for attacks against Israel. Because, okay, we might lose 200 hostages, but in the future, we might lose hundreds or thousands more.
Do you think Hamas expected their attack to have gotten as far as it did? My sense and my gut tells me that they were surprised about how far they could get in there.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I think that they were completely surprised about how successful their barbaric attack was. But I also think that Hamas didn't fully involve Iran. And I think that nobody's talking about this, but my own feeling was, or is, that if I were a Hamas commander, I'd be looking at decades of futility against the Israelis, and I'd be looking to ignite a wider war in the Middle East.
So that's the other interesting thing. So I don't know if you're aware of who Ryan Macbeth is. He's another YouTuber who focuses almost exclusively on these topics. And he had gotten copies or samples of the Hamas operations order. And it was much more sophisticated than Hamas seems to be capable of. As an example, they had the timing of various security cameras, when they came off, when they came on, where they were looking, what times to slip through. The other thing that they did as part of those programs you mentioned at the very beginning, where they had the equivalent of work visas for Gazans to go and work in Israel, a lot of those folks, they were literally mapping out some of these vulnerabilities while they were working for the Israelis. So,
as I say, sources I'm talking to have also suggested that while Hamas kept Iran largely in the dark, that there may have been Iranian support in hacking the Israeli intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance network all along the Gaza Strip. That would implicate Iran if it were made public. I think personally that this is just my gut feeling, that the Iranians trained Hamas in these kind of IT tactics, and that Hamas did it for themselves. I think Iran was actually caught off guard by Hamas's success. I don't think that Iran wants to go to war with the United States or wants a wider Middle East war, because it's quite happy spreading its tentacles as it is. And Hamas has caused a major distraction and a major attention on Iran. I think that Hamas was looking to ignite a wider Middle East war because they are nihilists. They consider themselves martyrs. They don't give a fuck about the civilian population. They say, oh, every Palestinian is prepared to die. Every Palestinian is a martyr. What have they got to lose? They're looking to ignite a wider Middle East war.
I get the same sense you do. I mean, some of it's based very loosely off of the evidence, but more of it's just gut. And the reason I say that is I think there may have been some elements in the Iranian establishment that maybe had a hint of this, but I don't think they had any idea. For Hamas, it was an absolute tactical victory, but I think it's going to turn out to be a major strategic miscalculation that's going to lose them Gaza and going to get them annihilated.
It's a major. There was a major tactical victory for them, an operational victory, but a major strategic defeat, because what they've done is they have destroyed the accommodation that they had previously with Israel, which was Israel controls around the borders of the Gaza Strip. It allows people into Israel to work. It allows aid to go into Gaza in return for Hamas keeping attacks against Israel to a certain level. Now that paradigm has been completely destroyed. Now Hamas has demonstrated to Israel that it is not capable of living next to Israel and that it has to be destroyed as a threat.
And the other thing, too, is to your point about the Iranians, this is not 2006, where the Iranians have easy access of retaliation against U.S. targets in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, there's still some in Syria and things like that, and, Iraq, but not nearly as many targets that the Iranians could have struck back against. And that was a major consideration in choosing not to take out their nuclear program. Now, not so much.
Yeah, and we also saw last week the American Air Force. They took out IRGC and affiliated targets, right, in Syria in retaliation for attacks on Americans. The Americans have made it very clear, okay, this is not part of the war in Gaza, but we will respond forcefully. And before, Biden didn't have a ball sack. Listen, I'm not a Trump supporter, but one thing I do love about Trump is when he fucking whacks Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC-QF. I fucking love that. I fucking love that.
Yeah, because then the Iranians knew we were serious. Like, it's a very different mindset. I mean, to give you an example, when all they understand, mate, is a big hammer on the head. That's all they understand. Not only that, like
dropping on the heads. That's the only thing that they understand.
Go back to 1987 when the U.S. Navy wiped out their Navy in a few days, like other oil platforms and things like that. And yeah. It's like 87, 88, like that whole period, right? But that's not what got their attention. What got their attention was when the USS, I think it's Vincennes, accidentally shot down an Iranian passenger airliner. Yeah. And the reason it got their attention is, for us, it was horrific. Like, it was a horrible mistake, something that we absolutely didn't do deliberately. But the Iranian mindset was, oh, now the Americans are serious. They're killing civilians now. And they completely backed off because of it. Like, that's the difference. I'm not advocating for that sort of tactic, but that sort of thing is what gets their attention.
Mate, when I was in Iraq in 2004, right? I was there. The Iranians backed off completely. Initially, in 2004, 2003, the Americans and Brits invaded, right? 2004, the Iranians were saying to the Americans, oh, we'll cooperate with you on terrorism and we won't support terrorism from like Iran, all the rest of it. Because they were shit scared the Americans were going to turn their guns next on Iran.
Once the Americans have been in Iraq for several years, you know that we were, right?
Yeah, I know. And once the Americans have been in Iraq for several years and the Iranians realized, oh, actually, the Americans aren't going to do a right turn into Iran, then they started supporting and instigating the Shia militias, which killed my mates, your mates, and Iraqis that we work with, right? They're scum, terrorist scum.
Yeah. All right, so the last piece of this puzzle is the UK is probably like this, but I know the US has suffered from a complete dereliction of duty on the border. And there have been millions of folks streaming across it. What are the odds that either Hamas and or the IRGC have been able to infiltrate into the US through these means?
Well, they already have been. I mean, there was the plot against the Saudi ambassador to the UN in New York, right?
Well, didn't they murder a Saudi in Washington, D.C.?
Well, there was an attempt against him. And then you only have to look at the UK. There have been numerous terrorist attacks in the last 2 decades instigated in the name of Islam. And these are all groups that have very similar affiliations if not direct affiliations to Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. For me, they're all the same. I mean, you have to understand the nuances between them, but it has the same kind of like mindless, godless, completely barbaric ideology, which is
nihilistic.
Kill anybody who doesn't follow Islam, to basically replace societies in the United States and in Europe and in Israel with an Islamic caliphate, like they tried to do in Syria, like they tried to do in Iraq, like the Iranians have already done in Iran. Okay, they're Shia, but it's the same kind of bloody mindset of terrorism, which involves oppression of your own people and complete hatred towards anybody who doesn't share your own religious values.
All right. Now, we don't have much time for this, but I'm going to ask this question. So you're Hamas. What do you do? What do you do to A, survive, and B, win?
Well, you have to think, are they rational or irrational? I think the leaders of Hamas are rational, even though they are led by an Islamic mindset of hatred. What I think they will try to do is, once most of the Hamas fighters are killed, they will probably try and use the hostages that have been taken to parlay a way for them to escape destruction themselves.
A good question for that. If you're one of the leaders who aren't with the people, aren't suffering with the hell that they unleashed, do they need to be worried about being assassinated?
Oh, they do, yeah, because even if they escape Gaza, even the ones now who are in Syria, the ones who are in the Gulf, Israel has set up a specific task force to hunt down every senior member of Hamas. So they're all dead men walking. Just like Israel did with the Nazi war criminals, just like Israel did with the barbaric savages who committed the atrocities at Munich in 1972. The Kidon of Mossad won't stop until all those people are dead. And maybe not just with a 9mm, but also maybe dead in a very horrible way.
Anything I didn't talk about that I should have raised, or questions that we should have covered?
Yeah, I think Israel's strategic position in the Middle East. Israel is a democracy. It's also America and the EU's number one ally. Israel also is the most powerful military force in the Middle East. It sits astride the Suez Canal and the approaches to the Bosphorus. Israel has alliances not just with NATO and America, but also specifically with Greece and with the Republic of Cyprus. So they counter aggression not only from terrorists, but also from the Russians in Syria, the Syria Assad regime, and also the Turks, who are not the best players in NATO. And also as well, the Israelis wax a lot of bad guys coming from Iraq through Syria on the so-called land bridge, right, to the Mediterranean. And they also ease pressure on American and British special forces who are aiding Kurdish forces fighting against Islamic State in eastern Syria. So Israel plays a very, very strategic part in Western military thinking.
All right, my friend. As always, a pleasure. Thank you. It's great to see you again. And, more episodes in the future, my friend.
And you too, brother. And here's my bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's two options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site. And there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.